Good morning, everyone. My name is Amr Hamzawy. I am the director of the Middle East Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I am pleased to join my colleagues, Aisha Al-Sarihi. Aisha is working for the Council on Arab International Affairs and for the Arab Gulf Institute in Washington. I'm also joined by my colleague Selma Khalil, who is currently conducting her MA studies at the Johns Hopkins University. I am joined by my colleague in the program, Sarah Yerkes, who is a senior fellow at the Middle East program at Carnegie, as well as my colleague and senior fellow at the Middle East program in DC, Fred Wehrey, for the Carnegie Endowment as well. I'm happy to join them and join all of you in a discussion about risks and opportunities of climate adaptation in the MENA region and questions around governance capabilities of different MENA countries and governance shortcomings in the Middle East and North Africa. I'm going to start with you, Sarah, with a question on youth activism in the MENA region and the way it has impacted or been impacting adaptation and mitigation efforts, as well as addressing governance shortcomings. Can you shed light on your recent research in which you focused on North African countries and the way youth activism has contributed to addressing climate governance issues? Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be with everyone. I think first of all, it's important that we just emphasize how important young people are to the future of climate adaptation and mitigation. Youth are, first of all, make up a large proportion of the population of the MENA region, but also are the ones that are feeling the effects in some obvious ways and some not so obvious ways. And so it's really in the interest of governments who are largely incapable of addressing the rapidly increasing climate challenges on their own to strengthen civil society, whether that's youth civil society or others, but civil society is largely controlled by youth, to help bear the burden of these challenges at home. And I think youth overall, what we've seen is they have a pretty poor opinion of how their governments are handling climate change. So on the one hand, by partnering with youth, by helping to empower youth to address climate adaptation and mitigation, that both helps governments in their task, but it also helps bridge the trust gap that we have right now between young people and their governments, so that young people and their governments can actually be partners in this. And one space, where this is really capable is civil society. So civil society is a space that's already open to youth participation. As I mentioned, a lot of civil society organizations in the region are run by youth, have very active youth participants. So it's not that difficult for civil society to take the lead in elevating youth voices and to ensure that the next generation is equipped to fight climate change. And this can be at the government level, at the national level, at the local level, or at the non-government level as well, through NGOs, through non-governmental organizations. And then finally, I would say that one opportunity here is that youth are really suffering from a disproportionately high level of unemployment in the region. And so, climate adaptation and mitigation is an area where harnessing youth skills in technology, in education, and activism can both help build resilience to climate change, but also create jobs and opportunities to prevent further youth brain drain and irregular migration that we're seeing in the region.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me ask you a follow-up question. So, what is it that governments can do to facilitate or promote better youth participation in climate-related matters? Be it we're focused on sector-related issues. There are climate challenges which are faced in different North African, Middle Eastern countries with regard to water resources, the impacts of high temperatures, impacts on the agricultural sector, questions surrounding renewable energy and capabilities. What is it that governments can do to account for better youth inclusion, and what kind of public policies or public policy designs would inspire youth to participate?
Yes, so I think, as I mentioned before, youth make up a disproportionate part of the population. So this is an area where, first of all, you just have bodies. This is an area where it's easier in a way for government to engage with youth than it is for them to engage with some of the older generations. And also, there's a lot, the youth that make up civil society, they tend to be better educated. They tend to have tech skills that are really important. So government figuring out how to harness these different skills is really crucial. And so, there's certainly a lot more governments can be doing, and I'll get to that in a second. But I do want to just mention that what we've seen in North Africa is that governments have been increasingly trying to give youth a seat at the table when it comes to policy making. We've seen this play out particularly at the different COPs, both COP that was held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, as well as the following COP that was held in Dubai. In both of these cases, we've seen a growing number of young people, particularly from North Africa, have a seat literally at the negotiating table, take on a role as youth negotiators. And we've seen this particularly in the case of Tunisia and Morocco, where the governments have really, for some good reasons and some maybe not as good reasons, but they've really taken on this effort of trying to make sure that young people are represented within their official delegations. And then also we have civil society delegations attend as well. But, again, there's a lot more that can be done. And I think particularly when we're talking about agriculture, water management, the other sectors that you've mentioned, what we've seen is that youth-led civil society organizations have been at the forefront of devising innovative solutions that include, addressing the increasing droughts, include increasing the lower agricultural output. We've seen civil society organizations led by youth really come up, harnessing, again, their education, their expertise, their technological expertise to come up with some new innovative solutions at how to actually address this. And so one thing that government can do is actually listen to them. And what we've seen, through the interviews that was done for this research, it was really disheartening to see how many young people or different organizations that have come up with solutions, and then the government just doesn't pay any attention to them. On the other hand, we've seen youth have a pretty successful track record in the region of engaging in activism to bring about real change. We also see that this region is ripe with entrepreneurs, with innovators. And so, I make the argument that harnessing the skills of these young people can really benefit everyone. But there remains this dramatic disconnect between civil society and the government. And that's not unique to youth. This disconnect occurs at all age levels. And we've also seen MENA governments put in place really restrictive legal and political measures that disempower civil society writ large. So, there's a lot of space for government just to listen to civil society, to try to implement the things that young people are advocating for. I mean, young people are kind of getting all the way there. They put in place, they come up with solutions, they devise these different situations, and then all the government has to do is take that and implement it, and something is failing there. And then the last thing I'll say, that's a real, problem that we've seen increase over the last several months, is the lack of funding. And so, we see that civil society is really reliant on external funding, on foreign funding, and this lack of funding that existed prior to the Trump administration has just been made so much worse by the dismantling of USAID, who has been one of the main contributors to climate change, to addressing climate change in the region, and other forms of assistance that have been really crucial to a lot of NGOs and a lot of the youth-led groups. So this makes it even more important for government and civil society to work together to try to find solutions. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. Fred, let me now come to you. I mean, of course, I would love to hear your take on civil society and young people activism in Morocco, which you've been working on Libya, which you have worked on for a very long time. But let me now start with a question on a research paper that you recently finished, in which you address, with regard to the efforts of the Moroccan government, different questions of climate governance, different positive components, different shortcomings. And the big question surrounding Morocco, which is celebrated as being one of the best practice countries from a climate perspective in the region, and the big question about inclusion. Can you shed light on your recent research paper and the insights of your research?
Yeah, no, it's great to be here, and thank you for the introduction. In many respects, Morocco is an interesting case study of a lot of the dynamics Sarah just highlighted. And as you mentioned, it is applauded, and I think rightly so, for its progress on climate mitigation and the transition to renewable energy. I mean, it has some very well developed plans that it has made progress in implementing and setting carbon reduction goals in the transition to solar energy, to wind energy. It has natural endowments such as a lot of sunshine, wind energy. So the government deserves a lot of the acclaim that it has received. However, you bring up the important point of resource vulnerability and vulnerable populations, and that's really what my paper focused on. And Morocco is incredibly vulnerable to climate change, especially in terms of water. Water scarcity. It's the second most water scarce country in North Africa. 93% of its land is arid or semi-arid, and this really impacts the agricultural sector. People who depend on their livelihood from farming or are associated in the rural economy. And agriculture comprises 10% of the GDP, but 30% of the population is employed in the agricultural sector, and that creates an enormous vulnerability. And when I'm talking about the specific communities, it's small plot farmers who make up around 70% of Morocco's agricultural output. These are not big corporations, but rather sort of family-owned farms, oasis dwellers, the informal sector, and certain ethno-linguistic minorities. And here I'll just sort of survey that there's a lot that needs to be done here. Morocco, has suffered over the years from a deeply unequal system of water distribution and agricultural output that in many respects was inherited from the colonial period, from the French protectorate, where the French were trying to maximize their agricultural output, and they instituted a profitable but unsustainable agricultural system that was modeled actually on California, and that has carried over, into the monarchy, where water is a source of political clientelism. It's benefited rich, landowners, and so the narrative that I got from a lot of activists, farmers, unionists, scientists is that the water distribution, policy and the way agriculture is handled needs a lot of work. To be very brief, the government over the years has tried various measures to try to correct this imbalance. They've shifted to from dams to groundwater wells, but in each case you see the same vested interests, elite interests, are perpetuating themselves. And so Moroccans talk about a hydraulic lobby. These are basically regime-connected elites who are kind of vested in perpetuating this deeply unequal system of water, distribution. And so the bottom line is this is all political. It has to do with the nature of the Moroccan, monarchy, the system, and it has led to sporadic protests, right? In various oasis communities, you've seen people, mobilize, and that has produced some effect. So protests are impactful in terms of raising awareness. But just to conclude, and this sort of transitions to some of Sarah's points, the big theme, also is the disconnect between the top level, between the center, and these disparate rural communities, the peripheries, in terms of who is actually serving as interlocutors. You have civil society in Morocco. It's enshrined in the constitution. You have trade unions, farming unions. But again, just to conclude, the theme I got was that, the government isn't always listening. It isn't always implementing those bottom-up measures.
Thank you, Fred. I mean, this is very, very insightful. Let me ask a follow-up question on. I mean, you spent some time in Morocco. You interviewed activists. You interviewed members in different farmers' unions, and you have a great understanding of what kind of shortcomings representatives of vulnerable communities, representatives of remote areas, rural areas see with regard to the government approach. If you were to sum it up in maybe key policy prescriptions? What is it that the Moroccan government, the central government in Rabat, needs to take care of, be it with regard to the agricultural sector? And I believe the number you've just mentioned, 30% of all Moroccans employed in the agricultural sector. I mean, this provides for great vulnerability if not addressed right, especially with regard to the impacts of climate change on the agricultural sector and the different structural changes that are happening in it in Morocco, be it with regard to the agricultural sector or getting more buy-in from rural and remote communities in renewable energy projects. What are the key policy prescriptions that have emerged in your research on the ground in Morocco?
Right. Well, there are some sort of top level big national decisions that need to happen with regard to water demand. And the criticism I heard is that a lot of this has been, the policies have been focused on, the supply side. So various things like desalination and building more dams and these sort of things. And the people that I spoke with, these are agronomists, they said, no, you need to shift the entire demand side of it. And that has to do with transitioning to more sustainable crops. And that has happened. There have been steps where the government has removed irrigation subsidies for incredibly water intensive crops like watermelons that were actually sucking up the groundwater to the point where certain communities didn't even have drinking water. And so these watermelons obviously are very profitable and they were benefiting certain elites, but obviously hurting other people. And to its credit, the Moroccan government has started shifting away from some of these water intensive crops. There's other measures, the government, for instance, has implemented water rationing in the cities in terms of car washes and hammams. But the people I spoke to said this is minimal because the urban use of water is actually a small fraction of the larger water consumption. So they need to get smarter on how they manage, water consumption, water demand. To your point about, local level initiatives, the theme I heard again was that, civil society, these farmers, these local grassroots actors have the expertise. They have, in many cases, traditional indigenous traditions for managing water, the khatara, the Amazigh system of agriculture. There are countless other examples, but the theme that I heard is, the government's not listening to us, right? And they don't approach it from a position of confrontation or criticism. They want to be partners with the government. As Sarah said, in many cases, they have the local level expertise and the government just needs to listen. And just lastly, a lot of this has to do, unfortunately, with certain red lines in Morocco. There are red lines for what civil society can talk about, and there was this sense that civil society can operate as long as you follow certain rules. But if you don't, one civil society activist said the government can make your life very complicated, right? And so there's other examples. For example, in major cities, large cities, it is not the municipal council, the elected municipal government that handles things like greening or tree planting or climate things. It's the Ministry of Interior. And that also created a disconnect where representatives of cities didn't often know what was happening in terms of climate adaptation because there was a lack of transparency in the Ministry of Interior. So again, to close, some of these things have to do with a broader opening of the political space, decentralization. But as going back to Sarah's point, I think it just has to go back to trusting and harnessing this enormous reservoir of expertise that you have in Morocco in the form of civil society and also youth.
Thank you so much, Fred. I mean, it's a mixed balance you're referring to. I mean, some improvements on the side of the Moroccan government, some policy shifts, corrective measures implemented, and some of the shortcomings which seem seem to be chronic for many polities in the Middle East and North Africa that continue to be relevant with regard to climate activism, paying attention to civil society, suggested policy prescriptions, better including rural communities in a sector focused manner from an interest and policy implementation, collective interest and policy implementation perspective. Thank you so much, Fred. Let me now move to Selma. And first of all, Selma, thank you so much for joining us from Paris. I know you're in Paris right now, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you so much for finding the time to join us. And in a way, we've been listening to Sarah's very interesting insights on youth activism in North Africa and the way it could do more in terms of facilitating and pushing forward climate adaptation and mitigation efforts, to Fred's analytical account of different recent developments in Morocco, and how the government is in some cases listening and in some cases not listening, and how structural impediments create an environment that is not conducive for inclusion of vulnerable communities. We're now shifting to Egypt with a similar set of questions, but with a focus on financing the green transition, financing the transition to renewable energy, and the account by means of which the government efforts, recent government efforts, can be evaluated, be it with regard to how impactful public policy designs are, implemented public policies are, and from a civil society perspective as well. Would you please shed some light on your recent research on the question of financing the green transition in Egypt, and government efforts and civil society remarks? Over to you, Salma.
Yeah, of course. First of all, thank you all so much for having me and for these really interesting insights. I think part of this conversation, right, is when you have a country that has, right, like a strong civil society activity and also a lot of local talent, how do you make sure that there is enough capital essentially to start triggering the kinds of projects that are necessary for a green infrastructure? So I think this idea of tailoring the right macroeconomic and financial conditions to make this happen is really important for countries such as Egypt. And I think Egypt is a really interesting case study to that end. And if you kind of take a step back and think about, right, like how do we unlock sustainable and effective climate financing, right? And particularly climate financing that is responsive to socioeconomic vulnerable groups, I would say that there's really three things that are quite important. The first one is a stable macroeconomic condition that has transparency, certainty, and accountability. The second one would be essentially leveraging the robust local talent that can really add value to the supply chain when it comes to green projects or infrastructure. And then finally, a sufficiently liquid financial landscape, right? And to kind of go into this a little bit more detail, right? So Egypt faces, I think, as many of us know, really difficult economic conditions, right? We're talking about a country with a very high fiscal deficit, like a low credit pool that is available to fund the private sector, declining FDI, remittances that are in flux, right? The war in Gaza has had really big impacts on the country's economy. And at the same time, Egypt is really triggering very ambitious modernization projects that include climate financing, right? And I think it is first important just to say out loud that, of course, climate vulnerability has really big economic stressors. And so even though there are fiscal constraints, right, and capital constraints in Egypt, it is really important to create the right kind of levers to ensure that we build adaptive, right, and mitigation projects as well. And so to kind of think about like what are the right types of levers to set in place to ensure that capital is flowing into green projects, both for adaptation and mitigation, I think there are maybe like two big things to talk about here. The first one is, or maybe three big things, let's say this. The first one would be a really strong legal infrastructure. Having big, robust national planning systems, as well as legal policies, tax policies, make sure that the private sector are comfortable enough that there is the kind of transparency and accountability for projects to then take off, right? An example here is actually at the end of COP27, Egypt was able to attract above $40 billion in investments in hydrogen technology because it had literally just a single law that enabled green hydrogen production. And this streamlining of legal proceeding is very attractive, right, for investments. The second category would really be fiscal incentives, right? So that ensures that green projects are commercially viable, and it also can de-incentivize investments and demand for hydrocarbons. So an example, right, could be tax incentives for renewable energies and electrification projects, feed-in tariffs for solar and wind projects, right, that has allowed the proliferation of massive solar parks. The Benban Solar Park, for example, produces enough energy for 420,000 households, and that was really a result of very robust feed-in tariffs that made sure that the private sector had a good understanding of what their cost structure was going to be, and so what the revenue stream is, and it created the kind of certainty that enables investments, as well as subsidy divestments from hydrocarbon, right? So decreasing the amount of subsidies that are allocated to hydrocarbons to decrease demand over the long term. And then the last aspect of this is, again, back to this idea of ensuring that there is a financial landscape that is sufficiently liquid so that the money can flow essentially from project to project, and that allows the kind of iteration and reinvestments that are really necessary. And here Egypt has done a number of things. They've leveraged debt swaps. So to give you an example, since about 2001, they've had debt for development swaps with Italy, where they canceled out the debt and then converted it into local currency and reinvested it into approved projects that further developmental and environmental goals. So, for example, they funded wastewater treatment plants through this kind of cancellation process. Another one would be issuing green and sustainable bonds, right? So leveraging debt instruments to essentially like invite in capital. To give you another example here, Egyptian sovereign green bonds are listed on the London Stock Exchange at 750 million US dollars. And these have also been funneled into the country to put up adaptation projects that are really important. And then finally, like a last tool within this instrument would be blended financing, which is kind of a mix of concessional lending and donation, as well as private sector financing. And I think this is a really interesting tool because what it allows for is to essentially allow for not just concessional loans from the World Banks or donations from foundations, but also leverages public-private partnerships so that the private sector is in Egypt domestically is involved in the kind of construction that is necessary for a green infrastructure, right? And I think overall, Egypt has really taken very big steps in order to further its own climate strategies. Now, if I just go back to your question about this idea of how do you ensure that you target and address socioeconomic vulnerabilities, that you involve civil societies, et cetera, I think that there are really, for me, three things that are quite important. The first one is to have really strong reporting, right? So it is not necessarily clear whether the green infrastructure that is being financed currently is actually targeting the right kinds of population, right? And also is using the local labor and the local expertise, and that is quite important. I think also generally adaptation projects, there's a little bit less appetite for the financing of adaptation projects. And so that's something else that needs to be considered, especially because more vulnerable populations tend to be on the receiving end of climate pressures. And then finally, it's not clear how much there is an interface between local governance and the regional government, right? So greater conversation between more top-level governments and municipalities could ensure that the funds and the projects are allocated in the right places, and also that expertise is leveraged in the right way.
Thank you, Salma, so much. Let me. I mean, these are great observations. Let me push you on one point which you mentioned right at the outset of your remarks, which is you said that Egypt was able to mobilize close to 40 billion US dollar for investment in green hydrogen projects because the legal framework has been simplified. Only one law that applies, and not that, I mean, as we always say in Egypt, that forest of different legal pieces, laws, legal amendments, stipulations, and what have you. What else? So I take it that reforming the legal framework to make it more conducive for financing the green transition, financing climate adaptation and mitigation efforts is one key policy prescription that your analysis lends itself into. what else? I mean, you were referring to at the end of your remarks to better public-private partnerships, local participation, municipal participation in national public policy making processes and steps. What kind of policy prescriptions would you like to highlight?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think to answer your question, I'm going to go back to these 3 points that I said at the beginning, right? Which is that the right macroeconomic conditions are really important. Absorbing the right talent and having the correct kind of financial landscape, all of these are really vital. And so to kind of think about these in a little bit more detail and to understand where improvements can be leveraged. So if we take the macroeconomic condition part, having very strong upstream markets, right, with the right conditions, sufficient institutional capacity, and a robust sectoral policy is vital. So as I mentioned, right, there have been some areas in which the legal infrastructure has been streamlined. Hydrogen is one of these, but there are other areas in which this could be the case. So waste management, for example, is an example of this. And then even if we take a step back, right? So Egypt has issued these really sweeping national priorities and strategies, which has been really great, right? The most recent one was in 2023. I think it was the second updated NDC, and they set really important targets. But within them, I think it would be really important to set clear and transparent targets for both the short and the long term across sectors. So making sure that transportation, right, like waste, so methane output, preservation of forestry has very, very concrete and clear targets versus more abstracted ones would help stimulate progress in that sense. And then second of all, which is kind of the point that we mentioned earlier, which is clear coordination across government and national governments and then regional or municipal governments is really important. So there hasn't been clear documentation as to how these national level strategies are actually going to be translated at the local level. And that's also, I think, a gap in this kind of legislative aspect. And then to think about the more business portion of this, right? Egypt does do certain things quite well. It scores well in ease of doing business. That includes starting a business, dealing with construction permits, electricity access, but there are certain governance portions within the private sector that could also be improved and I think have really big impact. And this could include stronger accountability mechanisms and smoother regulatory processes. And this is kind of where my initial point about having more streamlined legal infrastructure would be really beneficial.
Okay.
And then on the third portion that I mentioned, right, which is talent, I think that a big part of this, right, is how do you attract the right local expertise and how do you make sure that they are trained and that there isn't a flexibility within the job market for them to be then brought into the job market. And this is something else that I think could really be worked on. So an example would be labor taxation reduction, efficient employment protection programs, improving collective bargaining, so strengthening unions, making sure that there are training programs for the green economy so that local populations are then hired. I hope that this kind of gets at your
Yes.
question.
No, great. Excellent. Thank you so much, Selma. So I'll be coming back maybe in the Q&A with one more question on government programs with regard to the labor force. But let me now move to Aisha Al-Sarihi. Aisha, thank you so much for joining us. Aisha, you work for the Council on the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, as well as for the Arab Gulf Studies Institute in Washington, D.C., but you're based in the UAE, if I'm not mistaken. So thank you so much for joining us from afar, in spite of the time difference, if this is the case. And your work has been focused primarily on the Gulf as a sub-region in the Middle East and North Africa, and with an analytical focus on questions of energy transition in the Gulf. Would you mind walking us through your recent research on renewable energy projects in the Gulf, questions of the just energy transition and its challenges, its opportunities and risks in the Gulf looked at as a sub-region? Over to you, Aisha.
Well, thank you very much, Amr, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm speaking from Oman, not from the UAE, but very close to the UAE. So when it comes to the Gulf, I think for a long time, when we say the Gulf, we take it for granted as synonymous to the oil and gas wealth, right? But for the Gulf countries, and this is what I mentioned in the paper that I wrote, that climate change constitute a conundrum for the Gulf countries. Why? Because the Gulf countries have arid and semi-arid climate and environment, and this is the region is already, suffering from the high temperature, the water scarcity, the food security, and so on. And climate change is bringing additional layer to those existing challenges. The temperature is rising, especially for the summertime. The rainfall is very really limited in the region. And then also the region is exposed to extreme weather events. And also the dust storms are becoming more frequent and more intense, especially in the recent years. And for the Gulf countries, why I say it's a conundrum for the Gulf countries, because the oil and gas is not only and remain to contribute significantly to the economies of the Gulf, but they have helped the Gulf countries to actually, adapt to the impacts of the climate change through, for example, the importation of the technologies needed for cooling. The oil and gas revenues help the Gulf countries, to maintain food security through the imports, and also for using oil and gas to operate the power plants and for producing the drinking water through the desalination. And this is putting the Gulf countries in kind of like a position where they need to balance between addressing the impacts of the climate change, as well as also addressing a main challenge, which is the economic diversification. We know the Gulf countries are putting efforts to conduct social and economic transformation. But if we look closely at those economic diversification and transformations, we see that the hydrocarbon sector, contributes significantly to that as well. And so the Gulf countries realize that, doing away without the oil and gas constitute an existential threat for the Gulf countries. And this is why the energy transition in the region has been, and the question that you actually ask is a question that the governments in the region would ask themselves, how to transition in a just and inclusive manner. So it is really difficult to do without oil and gas. So how to go about it? In my paper, I mentioned that the Gulf countries adopt a dual energy transition approach, where, and this is the governments have advocated for at the COP28 in the UAE, when there was an inclusion for orderly transition. And how the Gulf countries are doing that, they are expanding on the oil and gas sector through, expanding in the downstream industries like the petrochemicals. But the way they are trying to do it is like to focus on cleaning up the existing hydrocarbon sector. And the Gulf countries are more advantaged in this aspect because they have low carbon, low cost oil and gas. So they are more advantaged compared to the other hydrocarbon producing countries or companies. At the same time, the Gulf countries have not shied away from adopting the renewable energy and dealing with the energy transition. We see an expansion in renewable energy development across the Gulf countries. Really, the installment of the renewable energy has increased to the gigawatts now. And then we see ambitious plans for hydrogen, for example. Carbon capture and storage is also part of the equation. And what I have seen is like each country, perhaps not really similar to one another, but each country is trying to use as many options as possible to decarbonize, but the difficulties remain there. And you asked about the challenges for this kind of transition. I think the main challenge now, as I mentioned, oil and gas contribute significantly to the economies. And oil and gas is not like also like, it is a rosy sector all the time. For example, in the meantime, we see that the sector is affected by the drop in the oil prices, and this is really affecting the government decisions on where to prioritize and where they can focus. And sometimes these kind of conditions delay the economic diversification and makes, for example, the adaptation, the climate change is a priority, but also maybe some projects in the clean energy will be delayed until like the market is improving. So I would say like financing the energy transition would be a challenge for the region, especially when it continues to rely on the revenues from the oil and gas. And the other thing, in terms of the human capacity in the region, well, I would say there is kind of like improvement in terms of the human capacity, because like the Gulf region has, invested in renewable energy, and this helped in creating the skills and building the expertise over time. But again, like there are new sectors coming in, like the hydrogen, like the investment in new sectors, like the battery storage, and these need a new kind of skill or upskilling. And again, one major challenge is that we are also speaking about transition away from the fossil fuels, and this for the Gulf countries is like the climate sensitive sector. Because for the Gulf countries, the oil and gas sector is a major employer in the region. The public sector depends on the revenues of the oil and gas. And so even though like it is not really like a work for the oil and gas sector, but it depends on it. So we will need to kind of find like alternative sources of the finance, and we need to also, for the oil and gas sector employees, we need to do upskilling for the employees there and find an alternatives for them. And also one major challenge, I think, the clean energy sector itself, it might not generate the same kind of revenue as the hydrocarbon sector. So also one of the major question is like how to compensate for the salaries for the people who work in the clean energy sector, especially for those people who will possibly lose their job in the oil and gas sector. So these are like some of the challenges that I can think of at the moment.
Thank you so much, Aisha. Let me ask you one follow-up question with regard to differences between the Gulf countries. I mean, we're looking at 6 countries, right? I mean, at the countries which are members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. I mean, what kind of differences do you see? I mean, from afar, one would hear a lot about UAE adaptation and mitigation efforts as being in a way similar to Morocco in North Africa, but in the Gulf context, as sort of paving the way for more innovation, more mitigation and adaptation efforts. And then we would hear, without naming, about other countries which have been quite slow to address climate challenges. Then we also get a sense of different national visions, be it in Saudi Arabia, the vision, Saudi Vision 2030, or comparable visions elsewhere, that are pushing forward very ambitious goals from a climate perspective. What kind of differences do you see on the ground between the different Gulf countries when it comes to the question of transitioning away from hydrocarbons into renewable energy, and how to do or conduct the transition in a just and inclusive manner? Which are the best practice countries, and which are the countries that need to pick up and catch up with others?
Yes, indeed. I'm glad that you highlighted in the point that the Gulf countries are not similar to one another. They, in a way, they are, but there are major differences between them. When it comes to the energy transition, they are following slightly different approaches. I will give the example of the UAE and Saudi Arabia because they are major players. As you mentioned, the UAE is leading the neighbors in terms of the energy transition, and the UAE has been really at the front when it comes to the economic diversification. In the economic diversification, the oil and gas sector, although it is still important for the UAE, but the country has managed to develop the other sectors that bring alternative revenues for the economy. But at the same and because of that, the UAE, see that it wants to sell the oil and gas as quickly as possible. It doesn't because it sees that in the future the demand for the oil and gas could peak and then decline. So it see the opportunity for selling is now. And this is different from Saudi Arabia approach. For Saudi Arabia, because the economic diversification efforts are not as advanced as the UAE, but the oil and gas revenues are still needed to support these economic diversification activities. For Saudi Arabia, selling as long as possible is the approach for it. But really both countries are pushing for advancing the developments in the clean energy in different aspects like renewable energy, the hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, as well as like tree planting, adopting, for example, in Saudi Arabia, Saudi Green Initiative. So this is kind of a difference in approach in the energy market in the long term. For the other Gulf countries, I think also it is important to highlight the oil and gas wealth for the UAE and Saudi is the biggest. For other Gulf countries who have a smaller oil and gas reserves, they are already in a situation where they need to fast track the energy transition and fast track the development of alternative economic sources of revenue. And this is the case for countries like Oman and Bahrain, for example. And these countries are really like trying to push for expanding renewable energy. In Oman, you see a great push for hydrogen, green hydrogen. There is a really a major focus on the hydrogen, as well as renewable energy. And I would see a different approach for these countries because, the financial reserves, for example, sovereign wealth fund is a bit smaller than the UAE or Saudi Arabia. So these countries are also trying to figure out, innovative financial approach to develop the renewable energy projects through the public-private partnership, or really like enabling the foreign direct investment in the country. So these are the few differences that I can highlight on.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Aisha. Thank you all for your excellent input. Let me now come back to you, Sarah. And I would like to move you a bit out of your excellent work on youth activism and their role in climate adaptation and mitigation efforts in North Africa to a wider look, maybe with a focus on Tunisia, on climate risks and opportunities. I mean, Tunisia is a country in which a big portion of the labor force has been traditionally employed in the agricultural sector, and the agricultural sector is one of the most impacted by climate change. Within the agricultural sector, the percentage of female farmers in Tunisia has been traditionally at the higher end within the spectrum of female farmers within the Middle East and North Africa, comparable to Egypt, comparable to Lebanon and Morocco. And when we refer to female farmers, here we're referring to a big vulnerable community that is impacted by climate change and lack of inclusion or lack of the Tunisian government addressing governance shortcomings. My question to you is, when you look at climate risks and opportunities in Tunisia, with a focus on vulnerable communities, who else next to female farmers, for example, would you see as the most vulnerable communities in Tunisia impacted by climate change?
Thank you, Amr. No, it's a great question. And I think, I mean, in general, women are facing, first of all, bigger impacts when it comes to climate change. You mentioned agriculture. Another big area of Tunisia's economy is tourism, and a lot of women make up, a big part of the tourism economy, whether it's in handicrafts or in, working in the different parts of the tourism sector. And this is an area where, this is similar to what Fred was talking about, where you have a kind of a difference between de facto and de jure treatment of vulnerable communities. When we look at women in particular, on the books, you have really great protections for gender equality, for domestic violence, things like that, but these are not enforced. And so the problem is that in the agricultural sector, as you were talking about, you have these female farmers who don't own their own land, and it becomes very, very difficult for them to actually purchase their own land. Even though there might be laws on the books that say they have that ability, that's not enforced. There's also massive challenges with education when it comes to what are your rights. And so, people might have rights on paper that they don't know about, or the judges don't know about, the police don't know about, things like that. And so certainly gender, women are one of the major vulnerable communities. I mean, others, as Fred was talking about, the rural communities, you have this massive difference between how climate is addressed in the coastal areas and in the interior of the country. And as we know, in Tunisia in particular, the government under Habib Bourguiba intentionally held back rural communities and the interior communities to the point where even today, in 2025, you have worse infrastructure, healthcare, education. All of that, this is all directly tied to climate as well, where, people are suffering from lack of infrastructure, from the inability to address the challenges that they're facing, and climate is exacerbating all of this. And so I think, in particular, you have, when you talk about women in the interior, then you have this double-edged, sort of double vulnerability that we're seeing play out in Tunisia.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I mean, this is an excellent and very useful observation, and I believe it applies elsewhere in the region as well. So in non-oil exporting countries, or to use more the modern terminology, non-hydrocarbon exporting energy exporting countries, so away from the Gulf, I believe in Lebanon and Egypt, in Morocco, this is as relevant as it is in Tunisia. Fred, let me now come back to you and ask you to move away from Morocco to the country that you've been working a lot on, Libya. And Libya, in a way, is a different stands for a different experience in the region. I mean, this is a post-conflict country where I believe the challenges Selma referred to with regard to Egypt, the simplification of the legislative framework, decentralization efforts, better inclusion between local municipal and national policy-making bodies is probably more challenging in a place like Libya, resulting in greater shortcomings when it comes to climate adaptation and mitigation efforts. Can you shed some light on the Libyan experience, Fred?
Yeah, thank you. I think Libya is an excellent case study for some of the points Selma mentioned on the imperative of revising legislative frameworks to empower local climate actors. And the big theme in Libya, of course, is that there's been such fragmentation and paralysis at the national level that real climate action has to happen and is happening at the local level, and specifically through municipal governments, right? Elected mayors and town councils. The problem, of course, is that these grassroots town actors are facing outdated legislation stemming from the Gaddafi era, from the security state of the Gaddafi era, that doesn't empower them, right? And so the theme that I heard during my fieldwork is, these municipal governments, they want to be more than just service providers in terms of climate action. They want to be empowered. They want to be agents. They are doing that in many cases ad hoc and, on their own initiative, and often with lack of funding in terms of, water rationing, preventing desertification through dune fixing, reforestation, but also they're the first responders in terms of these extreme climate events like wildfires and floods. And the problem is they are not empowered from a budgetary perspective to handle those, events. And in some cases, they're unable to receive outside help because of, again, outdated security laws. I mean, some of that, encouragingly, has changed. And what happened is that during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, there was some emergency laws that said, look, towns need to be empowered to handle the lockdown and the COVID measures. And those emergency laws are kind of being carried over or used by municipal governments to tackle the worsening climate crisis. So that's, in one sense, encouraging. However, we saw the very tragic consequences of not allowing towns to handle their own affairs with the Derna floods, right? In that case, it was not simply an instance of neglect, but willful, political punishment. And that speaks to the broader problem of politics, where the government in the east of Khalifa Haftar basically quarantined that town and didn't empower it to prepare for the flood. There were other instances, where I spoke to a climate activist in eastern Libya who was trying to import some foreign meteorological equipment to monitor the weather because the government's equipment was insufficient. So he was trying to do some good on the ground, but there was a law on the books that said you can't import this foreign equipment because it's a national security threat. So there's a classic case where a law is preventing a grassroots actor from, taking some beneficial climate action. And then lastly, it has important implications for what Selma said in terms of accessing external adaptation funds. Different towns, different municipalities cannot on their own reach out and get the funding. They have to coordinate their efforts and submit one request, what's called bundling their climate request for the funding. And that has not happened. I just spoke to someone from the United Nations that said there's finally going to be a meeting next month where the different municipalities in Libya are going to synchronize their climate efforts and hopefully bundle their requests for adaptation funds. And it's just remarkable that it's taken, the country that long to finally coordinate its efforts at the local level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Fred. So it seems in Libya it's less about decentralization. That's probably de facto happening on the ground. It's more about bundling and finding ways for different municipalities, different towns, and different municipalities to work together and to bridge the gap, the divide between the eastern provinces and western provinces. Thank you so much. Back to you, Salma. I mean, you had an interesting reference to public-private partnerships in the energy sector in financing the green or renewable energy projects in Egypt, the green energy transition in Egypt, and then you said that the labor force needs to be pushed into different sort of, I would say, modernization efforts that does not have to be led by the government, but civil society can partner, the private sector can partner as well. Can you shed briefly some light on what's happening on the ground in Egypt, where you see some improvements, where you see some shortcomings that need to be addressed?
Yes, of course. I mean, it's quite a big question, right? So, I think to start with the last part that you brought up, which is the labor aspect, right? So, Egypt has been suffering from both and underemployment issues, right? We're talking about a labor force that is very well educated, that is skilled, right? But there are certain inefficiencies in the labor market that make uptake a little bit challenging, right? And there are kind of two aspects of, well, there are a few, but I'll focus on two. One of them being skill, right? Like making sure that they have the right skill that is attractive within the labor market. And this is where the investment into green infrastructure is so exciting from that aspect, right? Because you have a growing market where skilled individual can essentially shift some of their expertise into things that are targeted to the green economy or green projects, and that increases, right, like availability of high skilled jobs and can essentially absorb some of these underemployed or unemployed people. The other aspect of this is right, like making sure that this actually does occur, right? That when there is funding that's coming in and when there's a bid for a project, that essentially this project becomes taken up by a local company. And this is where I think PPAs or incorporating PPAs in infrastructure projects is a really elegant way to kind of get at this issue. And to kind of break this down a little bit further, so I'll take the example of Hayya Karima, which is essentially this really big blended financing project that is happening in Egypt over the past few years and that has mobilized enormous amounts of money, so about 45 billion across its life cycle currently, in order to reach and address underserved populations. And I think where Hayya Karima has been quite elegant in the way that it does things is that it'll take concessional lending from the World Bank, for example, or other developmental banks, in order to essentially create the building blocks for an infrastructure, like let's say a wastewater treatment plant. And what it'll do is that it will contract with a domestic local construction company, for example, or operations company, in order to build this waste treatment plant and operate it so that it serves the underserved population, right? And so, like, essentially this partnership between the public sector, right, which the municipality, for example, and the private sector, a construction group, ensures that we allow viability for the private sector. So they have projects that are coming in, they have money that is coming in, there's guarantees because of these concessional loaning and because of the participation of big groups like the World Bank. And also there is, I think, an effort to make sure that the output of these projects serve underserved communities. So you kind of get at all these different issues. I think the question then becomes is that are you hiring the local population that you are then serving, right? That tends to be a little bit more vulnerable. And this gets into a question, I think, of ensuring that more local vulnerable groups do get the upskilling necessary over the long term.
Thank you, Salma. I happen to I mean, my family happens to come from a country, from the countryside, from the governorate of Minya in Egypt, which has seen a lot of Hayya Karima projects recently. And I can attest to the model you've just described, including the hiring of the local population as well. There are shortcomings regarding sustainability. There are shortcomings regarding what happens after the current cycle, but these are interesting questions to be looked at from a public policy perspective and to see to what extent is the central government in Cairo paying attention to local voices and local representation, especially of vulnerable groups. Thank you, Salma. Back to you, Aisha. And I mean, it's interesting to look at the contrast between different North African countries, be it Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, or Egypt, and the Gulf countries, in the sense of most of the discussion we've been having so far, based on Sarah's, Salma's, and Fred's input, has been sort of moving between government roles and civil society contributions, national governments, and local and municipal levels. In the Gulf, based on your insights so far, we've been hearing a lot about what governments do, what kind of differences do exist between government policies across the Gulf as a sub-region. Can you please shed some light on what private sectors do in the Gulf, what civil society organizations do with regard to climate adaptation and mitigation efforts?
Right. I think what we see in North Africa is something that's coming up to the Gulf, but in a very slow manner. And I think the main reason because like in the Gulf countries, the oil and gas wealth have mitigated or made that the space of civil society participation a very narrow space. But honestly, most recently, we see the role of the youth in participating in climate action is kind of like taken some base. In Oman, for example, there is an NGO, Oman Environment Society, which is organizing a dialogue that engage the public, the private, and the youth in speaking about different aspects of the climate in the country. And it's really active in terms of like finding climate solutions. In terms also of the youth participation or the private sector participation, we see a rise of small medium enterprises when it comes to the climate action. We see, for the recent years, the young people have traveled abroad to study about the sustainability and the energy transition, and they came back home. And those are the young people who are leading in terms of the establishing their own business to really help to raise the awareness about the climate change through their own campaigns. And this is at least happening in Oman. But also in other countries where the youth participation do exist, you can see it is mainly coordinated with the government. So the government actually oversees the youth participation. So that's that. In terms of the private sector, I see it from the economic perspective, and I see it from the regional government's trial to attract the foreign direct investment in the country. Now there is, when we speak about the economic diversification, we need to bring the investors to the region. So this is the same case for the clean energy, for the hydrogen, for renewable energy. And the governments are really trying to attract the investors. And we can see that this kind of attracting the foreign direct investments, creating kind of competition between the Gulf countries. And so each country faces the challenge on how to create the enabling environment and attractive environment for the investor. So, for example, an investor who comes from outside, they need to decide, do I go to Oman, do I go to the UAE or Saudi Arabia, which environment is the best? So there's kind of like a competition between the countries. But when I say that there is like what happens in Africa is slowly coming to the Gulf, I think it's mainly because the age of the oil and gas, maybe now it is fine in the short and the medium term, but in the long term and with the fluctuation of the oil prices, I think this is going to create kind of a stress on the state budgets and create more of a space for the private sector engagement. And again, also, this will narrow the space for the citizens to work in the public sector. And in this way, there will be a push for the citizens to establish their own businesses and participate in the economy, as well as participating in the decision making and the policies.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Aisha. So we're approaching the end of our panel, which has been extremely informative and insightful. Thank you all so much. I would like to come back to you, Sarah, for maybe a closing reflection, but also with a question from our audience who has been with us virtually in the last hour or so. The question is with regard to different examples, different cases of public-private partnerships across the Middle East and North Africa. So the case of Egypt has been referenced. Can you shed some light on any, excuse me, on any relevant cases of public-private partnerships in Tunisia or in Morocco, be it with regard to inclusion or specific mitigation and adaptation efforts, as well as any final remarks you would like to share? Over to you, Sarah.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think in the case of Tunisia, this is again an area where on the books in the law, you actually have pretty good public-private partnership laws that do encourage this sort of thing. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, talking about sort of the role of technology, the role of entrepreneurship and youth, I mean, this is an area where we have seen an increase in, I think, recognition from the public sector that the private sector, whether it is, you know, sort of the NGO sector, but also in private companies that have been involved in technology, that they can really play an important role in working with the government. So I would say this is a growth area. There's not a lot of great examples to point to at this point, but I do think it's an area that we're starting to see more and more public and private sector cooperation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah. Fred, the same question to you, maybe with a focus back on Morocco. I mean, we had a conference, our program had a conference recently in Tangier, and we took note in different conversations we had with civil society activists, with policymakers at the municipal level, that public-private partnerships in Morocco, especially in the renewable energy sector, have been promoted by the government, and the reference was to different success stories. Can you shed some light on the reality of public-private partnerships and maybe bring in the role of external actors? I mean, the EU, which plays a huge role in the renewable energy sector in Morocco, seems to be pushing and promoting public-private partnerships, greater roles for the Moroccan private sector.
Yeah, I don't have specific, positive examples on the public-private partnership. I will mention one example that was quite contested and unfortunate that a lot of my activist interviewees mentioned that was not helpful, and that was the privatization of water. And this was, again, intended as a positive adaptation effort, but very briefly, basically what it did is it commodified a resource that a lot of, farmers and towns believed should be a public, resource, a public benefit. And there were all sorts of, farmer unions that were saying, basically in the past, we used to negotiate with one point of reference, the state. And now, because basically it's privatized, you have water being delivered by private companies, and it's created all sorts of shocks. And so that's an example where it sort of went awry. The last point I want to mention is the point on the EU, and I want to mention this in the broader context of our conversation about adaptation and the necessity for governments to draw upon their own human capital. I think we're in the middle of a massive generational shock in terms of the willingness of the global north to extend development funds, action, material support to developing countries, to countries in need. And it's being felt obviously with the cuts in USAID, and that has had a big impact in terms of climate adaptation in Libya. There were a lot of US aid programs elsewhere in the Middle East. My contacts who are working on climate change in Libya are saying, look, the European Union in a couple months is going to cut their development assistance on, helping Libya because they need to focus on defense, right? Because so I think, and the UN is obviously going to be facing shortfalls. So now is the time for governments in the region to get smart and draw from within, draw from their own resources. And I think this massive shock that we're experiencing now just underscores that imperative.
Thank you so much, Fred. Aisha and Salma, we're left with 2 minutes maybe, and I have one final question for both of you. One of our viewers is asking about the potential for a system of carbon credits to encourage emission reduction and help with financing public mitigation efforts. Aisha, did you take note of any such discussion unfolding in the Gulf? Salma, are you aware of any similar discussions happening elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa? But very briefly, 1 minute each. Aisha first.
Okay, thank you very much, Amr. So yes, I wrote a paper, a whole article on the carbon markets in the Gulf, where I highlighted on the evolving carbon market in the Gulf. At the moment, there is no carbon prices in the Gulf per se, but there are voluntary carbon markets adopted in all the 6 Gulf countries in a form of carbon credit exchange platforms. and slowly, like, the system is developing. For the Gulf countries, the way I see it, the Gulf countries can play both a seller and a buyer of the carbon credits. Seller for the carbon credits through, the development of tree planting, mangrove systems, blue economy. Sellers because the oil and gas sector is a major contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, and so they can also buy the credits to maybe continue expanding the sector. So I would leave it there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Aisha. Over to you, Salma.
Yeah, so I think Egypt similarly has started to kick in some of its legislative infrastructure for voluntary carbon markets, but I think there is very much the potential for mandatory compulsory carbon markets to really help stimulate a lot of their greening, right, of their economy, and also create some more, right, like capital to be reinvested within the country. And something that I'll say is that what was notable for me as I was reading through Egypt's climate strategies is that there is no methane reduction targets, and there's also very little reforestation, right, ambitions. And I think introducing carbon credits can help incentivize two gaps, right, that are within the country's climate national strategies.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Salma. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Sarah, Fred, Salma, and Aisha for an excellent discussion. Thank you, everyone who has joined us virtually in the last hour and 15 minutes for a discussion on climate risks and opportunities, mitigation, adaptation efforts, and governance challenges in the Middle East and North Africa. This has been excellent discussion with my colleagues. Once again, thank you so much for joining, and stay tuned. More events, virtual as well as hybrid events to come from the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you all so much. Have a good rest of your day.